Hi everybody, Dana here again with more Tuesday tips for leaders of volunteers, and today having a little fireside chat about storytelling, specifically storytelling with the data and metrics that you have about your work, about your program, about your volunteers, and how they are positively impacting and force multiplying and building capacity for the work of your agency and the mission. So it can be very, very overwhelming to think about data and metrics, especially if that's not your area of interest or your expertise. And yes, as leaders of volunteers, we have to wear a lot of different hats from a lot of other careers and skill sets. But I want to assure you that if you don't want to be the person that crunches the numbers, that's okay. I'm not really a number crunchy person myself. I've learned to do it and I've had some interest in it, but there are lots and lots of people who can become your volunteers or might already be in your volunteer talent pool who do love to do data analysis, data visualization, and helping to craft a story that appeals to all kinds of other supporters or whatever audience you're trying to reach, and really serves as a case study to continue to get resources, funding, more people, whatever you need for the work that you are doing, especially in the volunteer services department. So when we think about storytelling, there's really a classic thing called a story spine in any kind of narrative, including narratives with data and math. And the story spine is probably familiar to most of you from kind of a fairy tale structure. The story spine of any narrative, including, what we're going to get into for how to use metrics and data this way, is every day was like this. And that kind of sets the story. It sets up the background of what you're going to tell, the kind of tale you're going to weave or spin. And then one day, something different happened. And because of that, this happened. And because of that, this happened. And then the entire world was changed because of this journey. Now, that's the most basic story points or story spine that any tale, legend, fiction, nonfiction, anecdote can be broken down into those points. When we're talking about storytelling with data, what becomes overwhelming is there's a lot of information and raw numbers to work with. And so what do you, very specifically for volunteer services, what is the goal? You kind of have to work backwards from what's the goal of the story. In a fairy tale, what's the moral of the story? What was learned? And in order to sort or report out the correct pieces to correlate to that, we really want to start with what kind of story are we trying to craft, and who is the audience, and what are they interested in, and what do we want them to know more about. I'm kind of talking in abstracts right now, but I'm going to give you some really solid models and examples. And some of this is drawn from a webinar I just did with VSysVoices, and I'm going to link to the full kind of panel discussion webinar about this with some other experts, including Joan Cardellino and the wonderful Karina Vargas. Really put together some great models and examples, so you can link to that in the video. But just to kind of keep it short for a Tuesday tips, when you're thinking about data storytelling, it's almost like you're baking a cake. You have all the ingredients, but you also need to have a goal in mind. And so no two cakes are alike, and I can't reach through the screen and tell you, for your organization, this is exactly the kind of story you should be telling. You may be able to get a volunteer to do that, and there probably are people in your marketing and PR, even IT department, that can help you decide what's going to be important data, or what kind of stories are going to be important to share with the community, with the audience, with the public. But if you think of yourself as a baker baking a cake, then giving yourself the ingredients doesn't necessarily mean that the story is finished just because you've got everything in the kitchen all lined up. So how you put it together and what you choose to emphasize, or what flavors of the story you bring out, is just as important as leading to the end result in your data storytelling. So Many organizations have dedicated staff or departments that create data stories with metrics already. So if you can, and I talk about this a lot, like align your work with marketing or finance or whomever in your other departments is telling the story, to make sure that you're not telling contradictory stories. So get into alignment, bake the same kind of cake that the agency is known for making, tell the same kind of story. But when you get all your ingredients together, you're not baking it alone. You could not only draw on a volunteer project leader to do this, or you can choose to do it yourself, or you can hand it off to these other staff members and say, the goal I have in mind is to bake a cake that tells people that our volunteers helped 1,000 kids last year learn how to read. So instead of just the metric of 1,000 kids now know how to read from our literacy program with volunteers as one example, like that's a kind of interesting by itself, but how can we tell that story and make it more interesting, not just anecdotally, but with even more numbers of incidents, of metrics that kind of led to that result, and that kind of enriches the experience, enriches the cake, makes it taste better. And also, putting these stories together, baking takes practice. I'm not the best baker in my family or friends. So telling good stories with the data and the metrics you have also takes practice. And whether that's you doing it or you hiring or finding the talent to do it or working with other colleagues to do this and be the supervisor, be the head baker, but not doing it yourself. All of that's fine. You want to keep that in mind. Now, an easy way to think about this, if you're not used to data analytics or doing data visualization and this type of work, is there's data. We're going to define a couple things. There's data, there's information, and there's knowledge. And they're not interchangeable in the way that we're talking about creating storytelling from data. Data are the raw facts that our systems and processes generate and collect. Like we have 300 volunteers and they did 3,000 hours of work in our literacy program. That's raw metrics and data. Now we want to capture that and collect that. And then that goes into context or information. Data that has been processed, analyzed, and put into a context becomes information. And another way to think about that is data correlation. Like this is how this all relates together. And here's the context of how we're trying to set up that story. And then that gets into the end product of knowledge. What is the insight that has been obtained when all the data has been reported and communicated in that story structure with that story spine? What is the final cake look like? Is it really successful or is it on cakefails.com? Hopefully it's really successful. So data capture and collection goes into data correlation, kind of that context, and then reporting and communication. And that's a really good, easy way to think about a story flow or a narrative flow for the data that you're working with, and keeping that end goal in mind and keeping in mind the audience takeaway. What do you want people to learn from what you're presenting, from what you're reporting out and how you're communicating it? And then what do you want them to do with that information? Is it a call to action? And that kind of tips how your data storytelling can push into recruitment and marketing and public relations or other areas that have to do with outreach in community engagement for your whole organization. So again, I'll put more links to a much longer, deeper dive discussion with a whole panel of experts that I facilitated in April. And I hope that you do enjoy these Tuesday tips, fireside chat style, and we'll see you next time.